Take aim!
Take aim!
You wouldn't want to live here during the Revolution. This was a bitter civil war, and it was particularly bitter in Monmouth County.
In Monmouth County and places like it, the American Revolution was won or lost.
There's just something about Monmouth, no matter what you want about the American Revolution. Do you want a kidnapping? We have that. Do you want a massacre? We have that. Do you want an elderly lady facing down the British Army? Ooh, we have that too. We have everything.
New Jersey's pretty much a huge battlefield on the Revolutionary War side, so you can't help but get caught up in the Revolutionary War history here.
New Jersey sees more of the war than any place else. There's more battles and skirmishes in New Jersey. The war lasts longer as a fighting war than in any other place during the Revolution. And so it's estimated there's more death and there's more damage in New Jersey than in other places.
You have one of the largest land battles of the Revolution fought right here in our own backyard, the Battle of Monmouth. You have the refugee town on Sandy Hook, and almost every small community across the county, Middletown, Tinton Falls, Shrewsbury, Matawan, they all have their own Revolutionary War legacies, stories of battles and skirmishes that occurred. If we move further south into what was formerly Monmouth County, but is now Ocean County, there were salt works trying to produce much needed commodities to help support the war effort. There was privateering, raids trying to capture British shipping. So Monmouth County sort of tells the story of the Revolution in a nutshell.
Although Boston is considered the cradle of the Revolution, Massachusetts in general, Monmouth experienced everything. Monmouth and New Jersey in general truly was the crossroads of the American Revolution. Washington himself spent more time in this colony than he did in any other. There were more conflicts, skirmishes, and small battles than virtually any other colony. The biggest artillery battle of the entire Revolution was right here in Monmouth County. And it's just the perfect example of what led up to the Revolution, what happened during the Revolution, and how we defined ourselves after the Revolution.
Monmouth County was an exceptionally dangerous place at the time of the Revolutionary War. There were over 100 documented skirmishes that were going on. And here in Monmouth County, there were many, many British supporters and loyalists. And it's known that there was more fighting here in Monmouth on behalf of the British cause than anywhere else in the state of New Jersey. People's homes were being burned, their property was being taken from them, people were being injured and killed constantly.
There was a lot of civil strife within the county itself. There were people that were still loyal to the king, they were known as Loyalists, and they fought with the Whigs or the Patriots.
We have an idea in our mind of what the American Revolution is. And the American Revolution is George Washington and his soldiers in blue coats marching onto a field and engaging British soldiers in red coats, and they shoot at each other. A few men die, one army gives up the field, and then they do it somewhere else. The vast majority of the fighting, and the fighting that ultimately shows which side is going to hold the majority of ground, is all done locally by irregular forces. What decided the war was whether forces allied with Washington's army could hold and keep the countryside, because the countryside is where you have farms and farmers and people who are producing what Washington's army needs, and that is ultimately what wins the American Revolution.
Monmouth County at the time of the Revolutionary War was much larger than it is today.
It's a big county. It's not just today's Monmouth County, but it takes in all of Ocean County as well.
We have so many different municipalities today. We have 53 municipalities in Monmouth County, but back at the time of the Revolutionary War, there were very few of those municipalities.
Monmouth was established in the late 1600s, and it was perfect for agriculture. Good grass, good water, temperate climates. So Monmouth farmers were doing very well. And Monmouth was in this sweet spot between New York and Philadelphia. Monmouth was also producing things. We were producing iron. So you had the majority of people being farmers or in the agricultural industry, but you also had a lot of merchants and craftsmen. People were making furniture, they were working metal. Plus you had the shore, which was also great because then you had easy access to coastal trade, and you also had easy access to the big New York markets.
You would have help, children, slaves. Slavery is very common. A lot of households owned 1, 2, 3 slaves.
Monmouth County today has a diverse population. In the 18th century, that would have also been somewhat true. And we think in Monmouth County, probably roughly 10% of the population would have consisted of African American individuals who were enslaved.
Majority were slaves, although there was a free black population at that time.
These individuals play a key role in the life of this county. They're deeply engaged in agricultural work. Many are highly skilled individuals working in ironworks and blacksmith shops. Monmouth County has a rich Native American heritage with the Lenape and their ancestors going back over 10,000 years living here. So it's a very complicated time for Native Americans as well.
Great Britain was actively suppressing the development of any kind of local homegrown industry. Great Britain preferred us to buy finished goods from English manufacturers rather than develop our own industries. They were not able to grow and develop as they wanted.
The first year of the war wasn't a war of independence. The first year of the war was a true civil war. We were fighting for our rights as free Englishmen, a right to a voice in Parliament, no taxation without representation.
It's important to understand the idea of a colony to a European power is a colony, is a factory or a plantation. In fact, they use those words in a lot of their documents. It only exists to enrich the mother country. It doesn't exist to provide people wonderful, independent lives. Conflict, armed clashes between British forces and American forces had been occurring for quite some time before the Declaration of Independence. Here on the Jersey Shore, there were British ships that grounded, and when they were grounded, they were seized by local militia long before the Declaration of Independence. But what the Declaration of Independence did is it took a squabble over British economic policy and it elevated it to revolution, the idea that colonists would create an independent nation.
So foreshadowing the revolution about a decade before, there's the French and Indian War, which stationed large numbers of British forces here in what would ultimately become the United States and the 13 colonies. One of the side effects of that war was that the British became much more aware of the wealth of the colonies and were more interested in taxing the colonies. Those taxes caused a lot of pressures on individuals living here who were not particularly well represented in Parliament and felt imposed upon by these taxes. And a series of acts, legislative acts, were passed, such as the Stamp Act, that again exacerbated tension between the colonists and Great Britain.
And so, starting in the 1760s, chapters of Sons of Liberty pop up across the northern colonies in particular. And these groups boycott British products. If a certain individual is not abiding by the boycott, they are advertised as an enemy of the American colonies. With the Declaration of Independence and the soaring ideals of the document, the idea that all men are indeed created equal and endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, that time had come. The path to conflict becomes irreversible with the passage of the so-called intolerable acts. And in particular, one of those acts shuts down the port of Boston to all commerce and essentially blockades the city. And at that point, the other colonies have a choice. They can let the people in Boston suffer, or they can rise up and keep the citizens of Boston fed. And right here in Monmouth County, a drive to raise goods for the citizens of Boston is led by Edward Taylor of Middletown. And that is the moment at which some type of armed conflict seems inevitable.
So imagine in 1776 a huge British fleet arriving offshore right here in Monmouth County, sailing past Sandy Hook into New York Harbor.
When the British come into New Jersey, and starting in August of 1776, and they overrun the state.
Sandy Hook is one of the most important pieces of land in the colonies because Sandy Hook has the potential to control access to New York Harbor. As the war is beginning, Monmouth County militia attempt to remove the lights from Sandy Hook Lighthouse to make it harder to negotiate the passage into New York Harbor. You can imagine the Americans, when attacking Sandy Hook, brought cannon up. They attempted to shell the lighthouse. That building was built to last for the ages and survived those attacks and remains today as an incredible symbol of Monmouth County. The British almost immediately see Sandy Hook, they relight the lighthouse, and they're going to hold it for the entirety of the war. So while Monmouth County is contested ground, Sandy Hook is held by the British. Sandy Hook also becomes important as a place of refuge for Loyalists. As the fighting heats up, as communities come into deeper and deeper conflict, Loyalists are looking for a place of safety. And they flee to Sandy Hook, which is garrisoned with British troops. There a community is created that's called Loyalist Town or Refugee Town.
Well, our first Civil War really was the American Revolution because it wasn't just the colonies against Great Britain. It was literally neighbor against neighbor. And you had people here in Monmouth not just being angry at each other, but actually fighting each other and killing each other because of our political beliefs.
There's still a lot of lack of awareness of what the Revolutionary War was really like. They don't understand the extent to which it was a civil war in which Americans fought against each other on both sides.
Choosing which side to go with is, I think, a real challenge for folks. Families become deeply divided, communities become deeply divided.
You have brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, as you do in any civil war.
Religion's a factor. Family's a factor. The Quakers are pacifists, and most of them will not support the war. About 14% become fighting Quakers. They do support the war, and they're almost always patriots.
Often we use the term patriots, and we might use it loosely to refer to folks who side with the revolution, who are for the revolution. Though, of course, folks who sided with the British probably saw themselves as patriots as well.
You had a lot of people who were loyal to Great Britain. You had a lot of people who wanted independence. You also had a number of people who were trying to sit on the fence to see which way things were going to go.
And then there are the trimmers that tried to make their way through the war by taking one side, changing their mind, or just trying to stay out of it.
So these are folks who see a horrific war unfolding around them with terrible loss of life, loss of property, and they're sort of trying to steer a middle course. They're not particularly tied to either side. And they may be a little bit prone to jump one way or another depending on what is happening in their very neighborhood.
And so many of the Loyalists chose to leave. A lot of the educated class, the writers, the doctors, the preachers, the teachers, left. They went to Nova Scotia, Canada, the Caribbean, back to England. They did not want to be a part of this rebel ragtag group, and so they made their choice. The ones who stayed made their choice, and they were fighting for a better future.
If you're a loyalist, you are seen by the Patriot government as a traitor. If you're a patriot, the British see you as a traitor. And both sides tried to get people to take oaths of allegiance to them. Also, in New Jersey and elsewhere, they start to pass laws. So you could be asked, okay, you take oath of allegiance. If you refuse, you could be put in jail. You could be exiled. And then by 1778, they started to confiscate Loyalist property and sell it.
It's been documented 127 families in Monmouth County lost their property and had all their possessions seized. They only passed the law making it legal after they had done that to a third of them. So it was just happening on a extrajudicial level, just mob justice.
Now, you have to always remember that the British, like when they're in New York, they do exactly the same thing. They confiscate patriots' land, and they arrest patriots, and they put them in jail. So both sides are doing this.
Why would you go against the most powerful nation in the world? The British Empire was the most powerful, the most far-reaching. Any normal, reasonable individual would think it was absolutely foolhardy to break with Great Britain. And not everybody would be a patriot.
The Americans who chose to side with the king were called Loyalists. They end up losing this war. They lose their property. They lose their freedom. They end up being exiled mostly to Canada. So it's a fascinating dichotomy that in the United States, these people are traitors and they're exiles. And in Canada, they're founding fathers and heroes.
And I guess you didn't know who you could trust either, because unlike some of our more modern wars where we have another, different nationality, different race, back then they all spoke the same language. So you couldn't tell what people's loyalties were.
The British, depending on the time of year, have between 10,000 and 25,000 men in New York City. And in addition to that, there are thousands of Loyalist refugees. These people have to be fed, they have to be clothed, they have a need for certain luxury goods. There are military wares that have to come into New York. And to get to New York behind British lines, they have no means of support. So they are tempted into a life of raiding back into Monmouth County as a means of support and a means of exacting retribution against the people who drove them out.
The local economies relied quite a bit on smuggling. Monmouth County was involved with that quite a bit.
The British holding Staten Island, holding Manhattan, holding Long Island. One of the challenges faced by the ground forces is how do you supply this army, especially with all these loyalists and refugees now packed into the community? One of the solutions to that problem is trade, and that trade is going on along the Bayshore, through Sandy Hook, into Staten Island and Manhattan. So Monmouth County farmers are sometimes making an economic decision rather than a political decision, a decision to support the British by sending supplies into New York where they can get very good payments for not just eggs and poultry and beef, but also for things like firewood.
The London trade refers to really trade with the British, and it's loyalists, but sometimes it's also patriots.
Being paid by the British provides much needed money for these farmers in rural Monmouth County and helps, I think, extend the conflict in many ways.
A tremendous number of British and Loyalist ships are continually coming up the coast past what would be the Monmouth County shore today. So if there's a British ship that's unfamiliar with the local waters, and most of them were, the chance of that ship grounding in heavy winds or perhaps in the need to repair itself after a hard transatlantic voyage, the chance of that ship grounding and becoming stuck was significant. And although the shore had a lot of people of fickle political disposition, when there was a British ship for the taking, these people became sterling patriots, because capturing a British or Loyalist vessel with a cargo of rum from the Caribbean or with military wares and textiles from Europe, this was a lot of money. There was also kind of these swashbuckling local privateers. They're very often in small vessels, and they will seek surprise. And then in a very kind of swashbuckling way, they come up on the hull of the ship that they intend to take. They climb on board and they create a moment where a couple dozen armed men have the element of surprise on a very often wounded ship.
With the breakdown of royal government, there's a real period of lawlessness. So in southern Monmouth County, parts of which today would be Ocean County, right? We have the Pine Barrens, and we have individuals there who are taking advantage of the lack of government to exert their own power and essentially act as raiders, land pirates, if you will, stealing from the unwary.
So the Pine Robbers are local Loyalists who do not join the British. The Monmouth County shore is very sparsely populated. It's full of swampy areas that make very good lairs for people who want to go underground. And starting in the summer of 1778, we see pine robber gangs starting in the pine swamps, areas around what would be like Farmingdale today and further south. They're highwaymen. They steal from travelers. And in some cases, they're bold enough to go after local leaders.
Others really see it just as an opportunity to take advantage of a lack of government to enrich themselves. So I think what we're seeing there is sort of groups that are acting as vigilantes, and this really increases the trauma of this conflict on local populations, because not only do you have to worry about formal armies marching through your neighborhood and fighting battles, but there is all of this paralegal or extra-legal activity going on where neighbors are being pulled from their beds in the middle of the night, individuals are being hanged.
Being an outlaw is a hard life, and many of them ultimately meet a bloody end. When other pine robbers are hanged, crowds turn out. There is a level of outrage that the people of Monmouth County have toward pine robber activities that perhaps they would not have toward men in uniform engaged in similar activity. In late 1776, it is the low water mark of the Revolutionary War for Washington's army. Washington's army has fought and been defeated by the British in a string of battles around New York, and the British camp as far west as Trenton. During that time period, local Loyalists rise up, and in Monmouth County, there's a period of time called the Tory Ascendancy. The Loyalists were now in control, and they established for a brief period of time a Loyalist government in Monmouth County.
And Shrewsbury was a real hotbed of conflict. So you had a lot of Loyalists and a lot of Patriots, and they were really infighting. The Allen House stands on probably one of the oldest intersections in New Jersey, Route 35, which was known as Kings Highway, and Sycamore Avenue, which was originally the Burlington Path. But both of those roads are probably thousands of years old and were used by the Lenape. The Continental Army had a small band of Continentals posted at the Allen House, particularly since it was right in the center of Shrewsbury.
Their job was to monitor Loyalist activities within Shrewsbury and the surrounding area. The Loyalists did not take too kindly to this, and they ambushed them. They came up the river, snuck through the hedges, actually camped out at the Christ Church, and came across what is now the intersection of Sycamore and Broad Street, and murdered 3 patriots and captured the 9 others.
And as the story goes, a man named Joseph Price, who was working as a British mercenary, had a band of about a dozen men, and they burst into the house right through the front door. And the Continental troops heard the noise downstairs and came racing down the stairs, and the first 2 soldiers on the first floor were bayoneted by Joseph Price and his men through the abdomen. And then the men dragged the Continental troops outside to die, and they took the rest prisoner.
John Burrowes Sr. was a successful merchant who supplied the troops during the American Revolution. So John Burrowes Sr. had a son, John Burrowes Jr., that became a captain in the American Revolutionary War, and he, with others, helped muster or train volunteers to become troops ready to join George Washington. They did that training right here on the property of Burrowes Mansion. So they were really kind of the thorn in the side of the Loyalists, and the British were looking to capture him. So imagine this. It's dark, it's midnight. They get a pounding knock at the door. This is the window, allegedly, that John Burrowes Jr., Captain Burrowes, jumped out of the night of the raid on May 27th, 1778. While in the house, the British came storming in. They shot their muskets. On the walls here are these holes that are actually musket holes. Margaret Burrowes stood here when the British came in and raided the house in search of her husband, John Burrowes Jr. While she was standing here, they asked her for her shawl to give to an injured soldier, and she refused. Because of that, one of the soldiers hit her with the end of their sword. It was such a hard blow that she fell to the ground, and she never fully recovered from that injury.
The Battle of Monmouth falls about the halfway point of the war. It's June 1778. At this point, the Americans have been on a bit of a losing streak.
Philadelphia was the capital of the young United States, and the British had succeeded in capturing Philadelphia, and much to their chagrin, the war had not ended. So after holding Philadelphia for a period of time, Sir Henry Clinton is appointed as commander-in-chief, and he decides to evacuate Philadelphia. He decides to do this by marching overland across New Jersey.
So the British are marching pretty much from Philadelphia through central Jersey en route towards Sandy Hook.
So here you have the British Army on the march. It's an enormous army, tens of thousands of individuals. Washington is in Pennsylvania. His troops have undergone a period of training by Baron von Steuben. They are better trained than they've been at any point. Ultimately, they decide they're going to hit the rear of the British column as it crosses New Jersey. And the place where they do this is right here in Monmouth County at what they would have called Monmouth Courthouse, the area of Freehold today.
General George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, saw an opportunity as the British troops were stretched out over 12 miles and appeared to be a vulnerable target. Washington rallied his troops and attacked the British Army as they left the Monmouth Courthouse area.
Take aim!
It was the end of June, and one of those days in New Jersey where it was like 98 or 100 degrees out.
Charles Lee, who's in charge of the American Army. He has about 5,000 men, and he was hoping just to get the rear guard, and he's going to try to surround them. From that minute on, everything goes wrong for Charles Lee.
I don't think they expect the British reaction, which is to turn on them in force and push back. Lee is caught in a very exposed position.
Fall back! Break!
He retreats. He begins to pull his men back, and historians have debated this for 250 years, whether that was a good or a bad move.
The story goes that, if depending on who you talk to, Lee didn't deploy his men correctly and ordered a withdrawal that was confused.
Charles Lee bumps into George Washington on the battlefield, and there's many legends and stories about what happens with them.
Where Washington ran into Lee and asked them, in not some uncertain terms, what's going on and why are you withdrawing?
Washington comes up on the battlefield, is appalled to see Lee's troops in retreat, rallies the troops, stabilizes the lines, and then this battle devolves into an artillery duel between the Crown forces and Washington's forces.
That was just brutal, back and forth with the large cannon batteries just fighting each other through this hot, miserable June day.
The longest one-day battle in the Revolution.
And this is the largest field artillery battle. But a lot of the soldiers on the Battle of Monmouth die from the heat. According to some accounts, as many die from the heat as die from the actual combat.
At the end of the day, Washington holds the ground. The British slip away towards Middletown, ultimately towards Sandy Hook, and back to New York. Both sides claim victory. I would say it is certainly a political victory for Washington and his forces, the Continental forces. They show that they can hold their own against the best of the British Army. They also have control now of a significant part of New Jersey.
It's like the coming of age for the Patriot Army. You know, they're at Valley Forge, and von Steuben comes along and, you know, starts really training them how to be true soldiers, you know, kind of like in the old, like, European sense of being soldiers, instead of like what some people might have called a rabble, you know, before that.
Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He was the one who had trained the troops during that winter at Valley Forge in 77, 78. And that's one of the reasons why we acquitted ourselves so well at the Battle of Monmouth.
While most historians agree that there was no official victor in the Great Battle of Monmouth, it was considered a strategic victory and a political triumph for Washington and the Continental Army.
You have history that's this old, you're going to have a lot of legends and myths that are going to arise alongside of some of the stories. Every myth tends to have a little bit of truth or something real that happened.
Many stories are close associated with this battle. A lot of legends, some facts.
It's also famous, of course, for the role of women. Molly Pitcher, she is part of the history of that story too, and I think part of the legend and lore of the American Revolution.
Women are present. Women are followers of both armies. They serve as nurses, cooks, washerwomen. Once in a while, they pick up arms, participating sometimes whether they liked it or not.
And Molly Pitcher may be more emblematic of a number of women who served with the Continental Army than just a single individual who at the Battle of Monmouth helped serve as a cannon that her husband had been part of a gun crew on.
We know about Molly Pitcher, Mary Hayes Macaulay, because people saw what she did. She herself did not write it down. Other people witnessed what she did.
So her identity was always in question.
There's a couple different women who get thrown around in there, but the best information, the most detailed research was able to identify her real name was Mary Hayes Macaulay.
It's a very, very hot day. I mean, people talk about the day of the Battle of Monmouth as literally being an inferno. The story is that she is bringing water to a gun crew, that her husband has been wounded or disabled and is unable to serve.
Molly sees him lying on the ground, goes running over, cradling his lifeless head in her lap. Hears the officer say, "Sorry boys, I gotta take this gun out of the battle. We don't have enough men." She lays her husband back on the ground and jumps up and says, "No, I will take his place," and for the rest of the battle fights on that cannon. Great story. The only person who actually recorded seeing a woman working on a cannon was a young soldier by the name of Joseph Plum Martin, who 25 years after the war published his book.
He speaks of seeing a woman, perhaps Molly Pitcher, on the battlefield, who is helping with the gun crew, and a cannonball flies and literally rips through her skirt. She is uninjured and continues to do her work.
She's not getting paid, she's a volunteer. Every soldier on that battlefield who's not doing a job is hiding behind any blade of grass they can get, and she's walking into harm's way.
I'll buy you a horse, me love, and on it you shall ride. And I shall take my leisure marching by your side. We'll stop at every alehouse and drink when we are dry. Be true to one another, get married by and by. Oh, cursed be the cruel wars that ever should they rise. And out from merry England forced many a man to fight. They took her Harry from her, likewise her brothers three, and sent them to the cruel wars in High Germany.
My family descended from the Lenape people here in Monmouth County. Native Americans still lived here in Monmouth County, and Native people were expert scouts and guides. They also served as foragers, finding food for the armies. They served as spies to find out where British troops were, where they were going. The tribal nations consisted of over 80 groups. They spoke a dozen different languages and dialects. They had the same kind of diversity as Europeans.
These are the tribes that sent numbers of men to serve with George Washington's army. In 1776, they were at Saratoga, they were at Valley Forge, and some of them were at Freehold at the Battle of Monmouth.
They were good fighters. They were guerrilla fighters. They didn't stand in a line and wait to be shot.
A lot of African Americans served for several years because for the first time they're experiencing actual freedom by being in the army. They're no longer on a plantation. They're no longer being a slave. They're getting promises of maybe land and other things after the war. So I think freedom was a huge driver for African Americans.
75% of the people that signed the Declaration of Independence, 75% of those men were slaveholders.
George Washington was a slave owner. He had 144 slaves at Mount Vernon.
And the great irony of that is, of course, it's a war for independence, but we are still a slave state.
When the revolution started, Lord Dunmore of the British Army actually announced that if you were an enslaved in the colonies and you escaped to the British forces, you would be given freedom.
They would get their freedom at the end of what he thought was going to be a couple of months of conflict.
Hey. And it wasn't because the British were so fond of freedom, but because they knew it would interrupt the colonial economy if you had large numbers of enslaved leaving the farms.
One of the most interesting Monmouth County stories from the Revolution is the story of Colonel Ty, or Titus Corliss. So this is an enslaved African-American man in the Corliss family.
Colonel Ty is very interesting, and I think we know a little bit more about him because he attracted so much attention. But he was enslaved in Monmouth County by a man named Corliss.
He's part of a community in the area around Shrewsbury that's going through some great changes right before the Revolution. This is a community with many individuals who are Quakers, and the Quaker meeting is debating whether folks should still be enslaved. And ultimately, they're going to decide, no, they shouldn't be.
So the Quakers say, you can't own slaves and still be a Quaker. And there are some Quakers who owns Colonel Ty. They say they will keep their slaves, and they are disowned by the Quakers.
Colonel Ty, he was an African slave from Monmouth County, from right here, who heard the call from Dunmore's Loyal Proclamation.
The British offer, quote unquote, freedom to slaves who will join them.
Colonel Ty runs away. We know that because John Corliss takes out ads in the Philadelphia newspaper and also New York newspaper to try to recover him.
Ultimately, he returns to Monmouth County. He's probably living for part of this period out on Sandy Hook. He gains the honorific title of Colonel Ty.
Sandy Hook is a British naval base. The British occupy Sandy Hook longer than any other piece of the rebelling 13 colonies.
You have folks, often folks who might have had some wealth, who have fled from Monmouth County to the safety of being behind those British lines. You have the associated Loyalists. You have formerly enslaved people who have fled to the British lines as well, and they're all interacting in this tight little community.
A British officer calls it a dismal, barren spot and calls the Loyalist settlement that grows up on Sandy Hook a stinking edifice. Nonetheless, there is a Loyalist settlement called Refugee Town. So Ty and other runaway slaves become active in the irregular raid warfare that is conducted from Sandy Hook. And they start raiding back into Monmouth County.
And so he leads mixed groups of whites and blacks, loyalists that go and attack patriots in Monmouth County. And he's very effective.
And this group would subsequently be called the Black Brigade. And Ty leads at least 5 raids into Monmouth County, and highly effective raids from a man-stealing perspective, and probably just as important, highly effective raids in terms of capturing livestock and expensive household goods, because Ty is self-financing. No one is giving him money.
I heard the term cowboys used for those folks, and they would attack farms in Colts Neck and all over the area and burn those farms and raid them and take a lot of their goods and use it to benefit the British Army. There are a lot of newspaper articles talking about how these guys were the terror of Monmouth County.
Titus, Colonel Ty, becomes this incredibly famous and infamous figure. He's probably the most famous black revolutionary fighter for the British throughout the colonies.
This strikes incredible fear throughout Monmouth County as all the white slave owners realize that some of their former slaves are out there coming back, and they don't think that they're going to be very nice about how they're treated.
We in the North want to think, and have actually been told, that we treated our enslaved people better than they did down south. Completely false.
They terrorized patriot slave owners, patriot farms. Their focus was freedom, right? And freedom for African Americans was different than the type of freedom that other patriots were seeking.
He too is a freedom fighter, but he's fighting against the revolution. He sees his best chance for freedom being with the Crown forces.
He obviously knew or felt and hoped that he would be free at the end of the British defeating the Americans.
However, raiding is dangerous. And so Ty's last raid is the capture of Joshua Huddy, who was a tavern keeper in Colts Neck. When the war started, he was a patriot. He was a solid supporter of the revolution. He commanded a company of state troops. Huddy, however, had a knack for controversy and scandal, both in his personal life and his public life. He was involved in the hanging of a loyalist named Stephen Edwards in 1777. And Edwards was hanged on suspicion of spying, but he was never given a full trial. And Huddy had a personal role, according to testimony, in the hanging of Edwards. And so Huddy was a marked man by Loyalists for quite some time throughout the war, and he had a number of other controversies. He was, for example, brought before the Monmouth County courts more than once for assaults. He had a messy domestic life with a first wife who was estranged from him.
And he's virtually the mirror, literally, image of Colonel Ty. He's raiding British Loyalists throughout Monmouth County, while Colonel Ty, who he later confronts, is raiding from Sandy Hook rebels here in Monmouth County. And so they become familiar with each other. And then in 1778, the end of the summer, Colonel Ty leads a group, Black Brigade and also white refugees, from Sandy Hook. They besiege Joshua Huddy's house, which is in Colts Neck next to the tavern. The legend there is that it's a 3-hour siege.
And they were able to capture Huddy after Huddy put up a spirited defense with a servant woman, Lucretia Edwards.
They take everybody back to the beach and they're starting to load them on boats, but the members of the Middletown militia catch wind and there's a pitched battle at the beach. Joshua Huddy jumps off the boat and gets shot in the thigh, but he escapes. Colonel Ty gets shot in the wrist.
Ty dies from infection setting in after the wound. Joshua Huddy does make it back to shore and is not captured. And for this, he does become a local hero, and his spirited defense of his tavern and the escape. 2 years later, Huddy is commanding state troops at Toms River and is captured by a much larger raiding party. Pretty radical folks called the Associated Loyalists take him out of jail and bring him over to the Navasinga Highlands and hang him. David Foreman of Manalapan, who was a militia general and also a Continental Army colonel, who is a true patriot in terms of his energy level for the Continental cause, but nonetheless seems to have no boundaries in terms of his ethics. Foreman, in the summer of 1780, gets more than 400 signatures on this document called the Association for Retaliation. And this document basically promises eye for an eye justice anytime an associator, a signer of the document, is hurt. So if this person has their farm burned, we're going to burn a farm, all the way up to life for life.
In reaction to that, we have other folks who form the Associated Loyalists, and they're largely led by New Jersey's last royal governor, William Franklin, the son of Benjamin Franklin, and they act to support the Loyalists and to try and put down the rebellion. But really, whenever patriots are captured, they risk imprisonment.
The British took prisoners into Manhattan and they put them in what had been sugar warehouses, apparently, in very, very crowded situations. But they also put them on ships.
So these are ships without sails that are anchored in New York Harbor off Manhattan, very hard to escape from, in horrific conditions. So Patriot troops captured are packed in, many pass away.
It's estimated that at least about 50% of them die. The death rate is absolutely enormous, and they toss the bodies into the water.
One of the most infamous of the prison hulks, the prison ships, was one that was named the Jersey.
So one of the people who is supposedly imprisoned on the Jersey was Philip Freneau from Monmouth County, who goes on later in life. He writes poetry, and one of his most famous poems is called, I think it's The British Prison Ship, in which he says how terrible it was.
So that experience is really traumatic, and individuals who survive it and may be exchanged later in the war often suffer lasting health effects, never fully recover from it.
So we're typically taught that the Battle of Yorktown is the last battle of the American Revolution. After that, the British cease offensive operations in America, and presumably the war is over. Except in Monmouth County, we know that's not the case. The irregular warfare continues through the end of 1782, more than a year later. Local loyalists continue to raid from Sandy Hook, and those pine robber groups, they continue to engage in robberies and violence against the local population.
But most of the Loyalists, they accept the peace treaty. And if they don't accept the peace treaty, then they go to Canada, or they go to England, or they go to the West Indies.
Since they had no assets, the land was taken away from them. Some moved to Staten Island or upstate New York and just blended in. But as many as 10% of the population left the county.
the enslaved, those who are promised their freedom. Sometimes they got it, and sometimes they didn't.
One of the wonderful things about living in Monmouth County is that we have reminders of the American Revolution all around us.
Early on, people in Monmouth understood the importance of history and of preserving it. We're really fortunate in Monmouth to have the number of surviving structures that we do, that were literally present, that saw, that witnessed everything that happened during the Revolution.
One of the best preserved 18th century taverns that still survives in the county and probably in the state is the Allen House in Shrewsbury, which was once the Blue Ball Tavern. Nearly every community, from the Burrowes Mansion in Matawan to Monmouth Battlefield State Park to St. Peter's Church in Freehold to the Covenhoven House, Christ Church, they're everywhere. They all would have been witnesses, if you will, to the Revolution. So they're still part of our landscape.
We see how important and vital Monmouth County was to the Revolutionary War. And if you look across our great county, you'll see the impact. We see the structures still standing there. We see the preservations of those buildings and the land still there. It's our job today, in today's era, to make sure that continues to be preserved and those buildings stay standing.
All of these sites take time and effort and volunteers and funds to maintain. And the land, unfortunately, is being sold off of the sites that are not already preserved.
And it's one thing to read about a place, but it's another thing entirely to actually be there and walk on the same floors and walk through the same doors and just experience the atmosphere.
Why are we doing this? And that's the history. Making sure people realize the place you live in, how important and vital it was and impactful to not just Monmouth County, but to our nation.
I do a lot of school groups. I see about 3,000 to 5,000 school students a year through the park. We use the site as a teaching tool, and all around the edges of the parkland that we have today, there is pressure to develop warehouses, more housing.
We think these stories are important, and the people who made these stories are important enough that their legacy continue.
Make ready!
And even though you don't see a lot of us out here doing living history and interpreting for various reasons, we were there, we were an important part of this, and we've been fighting for America's values and freedoms since the very beginning. On a Saturday, I come out in this kit and it's hot, and like, I want to be part of this. I want to tell the story. I come from something great. I wasn't just like a slave, I was more, even if I was a slave, we resisted.
And it gives the audience a chance to see that we were here too. It wasn't just George Washington, Ben Franklin, and his horse won the entire Revolutionary War. He had men behind him of all walks of life and of all shapes and sizes and colors.
The American dream was born during this period of the Revolution, a dream of not being under the crown, of having a say in how your government works.
I think Monmouth still echoes with the American Revolution because we believe its stories and the people who made those stories, their voices deserve to continue to be heard.